How y'all doing? God bless y'all. Today I'm going over chapters 17 and 20 of Leviticus because it focused heavily on holiness, moral boundaries, worship, and separation from the practices of surrounding nations. And the reason I combine these chapters is because many of the themes they build on each other and show how God was shaping not only Israel worship, but also their everyday behavior, morality, relationships, and discipline. Going to chapter 17, y'all, it focuses on sacrifices and the sacredness of blood. And when you get to verse 11, it says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood." Blood represented life itself. God was teaching Israel that sin wasn't casual and that atonement required sacrifice. This is often connected symbolically to Jesus shedding his blood for mankind. When you get to verse 13, it continues emphasizing respect for life by instructing hunters to pour out the blood and cover it with dust instead of treating it carelessly. And I wrote down some more commonly confusing phrases throughout chapter 17. When it says blood shall be imputed unto that man, this means guilt or accountability would be counted against that person. When it also says offer sacrifices unto devils, this refers to sacrifices connected to false gods, idols, and demonic worship practices. And unclean to the evening is basically meaning that whoever was unclean, they were unclean until sunset. Moving on to chapter 18. Now, chapter 18, it focuses on moral boundaries and the corrupt practices of surrounding nations, the pagan nations. Verse 3, it warns Israel not to follow the customs of Egypt or Canaan because many of those cultures openly practice sexual immorality, idolatry, and pagan practices. Many of these sins, they were already being practiced openly by the people that surrounded them, which is why God repeatedly warned Israel not to blend in with them. And when you get to verse 18, it continues establishing moral boundaries with relationships and family structure. Verse 21 mentions Molech. Molech is a false god associated with child sacrifice. Some pagan nations literally sacrifice their children in worship to Molech. This shows how spiritually dark and corrupted many surrounding nations have become, y'all. God was protecting Israel spiritually while also preventing them from slowly becoming comfortable with evil. Verse 23, it warns against confusion between humans and beasts. Bestiality, I believe that's what it's called in today's time. And that's continuing the theme of unnatural corruption and moral disorder. Some commonly confused phrases, when it says uncovered nakedness, y'all, that's a Hebrew expression meaning sexual relations, not merely seeing someone unclothed. When it talks about the profane the name of God, this is to dishonor or disrespect God through sinful actions or false worship. When it say the land vomited out her inhabitants, that's symbolic imagery showing rejection and judgment because of persistent wickedness. And abomination, something detestable or morally offensive, etc. And chapter 19, y'all, it becomes extremely practical and it shifts into everyday living and everyday holiness. When you get to verse 2, it says, "Ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy." That same command is later repeated in the New Testament because it is written, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." That's in 1 Peter 1:16. And this chapter, it reveals that holiness affected everyday behavior, not just worship ceremonies, y'all. When we get to verse 3 talks about, "Ye shall fear every man his mother and his father." The word fear here does not mean afraid, y'all. It means obedience, it means honor, reverence, and recognizing authority. God understood that when children stopped respecting their parents or authority or discipline, correction, and structure, that within society, it slowly begins to collapse. Parents were meant to teach wisdom, instruction, boundaries, and the ways of God. That command is repeated again in the New Testament, not just the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it says, "Honor thy father and mother," and that's in Ephesians 6:2. When you get to verse 5, it discusses peace offerings being offered at your own will. God didn't want forced worship or empty religious actions done out of obligation. He wanted sincerity, willingness, and genuine obedience from the heart. It also says, "For God loveth a cheerful giver," and that's in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7. And verse 9 talks about leaving the corners of fields and the gleaning for the poor. Gleanings, they were leftover crops intentionally left behind so poor people or widows and strangers could gather food for themselves. The law reveals God's compassion and provision for vulnerable people, y'all. And verse 12, it warns against lying and swearing falsely by God's name. In the New Testament, Colossians chapter 3, verse 9, it says, "Lie not one to another." Verse 16 says, "Thou shalt not go up and down as a talebearer." Now, a talebearer is someone who gossips, y'all, who spreads rumors, drama, or harmful information about others. Gossip destroys trust, relationships, families, and reputations. And that's why that law is there. Verse 19 through 20, it continued discussing moral boundaries. Verse 20 mentions a woman who was betrothed. I think I got that right, y'all. Meaning a legally promised or engaged to another man. The word scourge refers to punishment or correction connected to violating covenant boundaries. And some other phrases in here, when it says love thy neighbor as thyself, is basically treat others with the same care, fairness, and concern naturally that you want for yourself. And uncircumcised fruit is symbolically, it just means forbidden, unclean, or not yet set apart for use. Observed times means superstitious divination or pagan attempts to protect events spiritually apart from God. Chapter 20 continues to address idolatry, immorality, and holiness. Verse 2, it again mentions Molech and condemns child sacrifices. Verse 7 says that to sanctify yourselves, therefore, and be ye holy. Sanctify means to separate yourself and set yourself apart for God. When we get to verse 10 through 13, it continued addressing adultery, incest, and unnatural relationships, showing just how serious God viewed actions that damaged family structure and morality. Verse 23, it warns Israel not to walk in the customs of the nations God cast out before them. And the word abhorred, y'all, it means something detestable, deeply hated, or rejected because of wickedness and corruption. And one thing that stands out to me throughout these chapters is how many of these principles continue in the New Testament. While some laws were connected specifically to sacrifices and ceremonial practices for Israel, many moral teachings, y'all, continue through Jesus and the apostles. Commands about holiness, honoring parents, sexual morality, honesty, loving your neighbors, avoiding idolatry, helping the poor, and controlling the tongue are all repeated throughout the New Testament. It shows that God wasn't only concerned about outward rituals. He was also, or he still cares about the condition of our heart and how we treat one another. And another pattern throughout these chapters is that God continuously established boundaries to keep his people from slowly drifting away from him. Without boundaries, people slowly normalize things that they once knew were wrong. And to give y'all an example of this, because, we all think we know better than God sometimes, and that's sad. It's similar to guardrails in a bowling alley. No matter how far right or left you drift, the rails will keep you from falling into the gutter. And it's the same way, like these laws repeating after the next about protection, guidance, and correction. Some people still may want to remove the rails thinking they got everything under control, but without the boundaries, people can slowly drift into places they never expected to end up. Sometimes, sometimes people, they just don't realize how far they've drifted until they looked up and barely recognized the direction their life is going. So we should ask ourselves, are there areas in our life where we have removed boundaries that God was actually trying to use to protect us?